Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to discuss the global scope, the global situation of the special military operation. We know that currently the Russians are counterattacking in the vicinity of the Bradley Square, and the Russians managed to achieve some success and results and force the Ukrainians to step back. We know that there are some clashes and activity of the Russian forces in the north of Priyutine, and also the Russians are trying to storm Novomikhailivka from the north and from the south, and this is also the results. And also in these two operations the Russians decide who are trying to counterattack, not the Ukrainians. We see that the Ukrainians took a decision to go into the depth defense. Furthermore, we know that currently the Russians are trying to storm Avdiivka, and the Russians have already called this operation Avdiivka News, and all the Western countries who knows, but we understand the main purpose of the Russians according to the title of this special operation, Avdiivka News. When talking about Bakhmut and Artyomovsk, we know that Ukrainians stopped any attempts to continue their offensive operation in the direction of Kurdyumovka, Bakhmut, or on the northern flanks. The only thing that Ukrainians managed to achieve is to force the Russians to step back from these railway tracks from the Ukrainian side to the Russians. When talking about Kupiansk and Liman front line, we know that the Russians are attacking in this area. We don't have almost nothing from this territory, and I'm talking about geolocated videos, but the only thing we have is some reports from the Ministry of Defense regarding the losses and so on. So this is the global scope, and we see that Ukrainians are currently trying to defend themselves and they're not attacking. Furthermore, we got very interesting updates from Kiev. According to information we have, the Ukrainian authorities are planning to launch complete total mobilization, not the mobilization that we saw a year ago or months ago. This is going to be completely different mobilization. This is going to be a total mobilization. But you know that total mobilization is a very difficult thing. How are you going to support army? So obviously the Ukrainians, for example, if they have right now 1 million army, let's say, or 500,000 soldiers or 700,000 soldiers, doesn't matter. They're not going to increase the number, like for example from 500,000 to 1 million. Because they don't have money to support this army. They need to pay salaries, they need to pay money, they need to feed, they need to get more weapons, and so on and so on. So obviously the Ukrainians are planning to start total mobilization because they're planning to reduce their current army. Usually, when talking about the military science, every time a country launches mobilization, that means that the country is planning to attack. When talking about the Russians, they have their own strategies, and they try to sign contracts. And for example, a lot of Russian authorities reported that the Russians have signed contracts within around 400,000 soldiers. So it's something like a part of mobilization. So that means that the Russians are ready to attack. And the Ukrainians are planning to launch mobilization because they're planning to launch offensive operation, a very powerful offensive operation, and they will replace the losses. They have current losses with new mobilized forces. But the question is where exactly the Ukrainians are planning to attack. For example, today Vladimir Putin was interviewed by some Russian press, and he was asked lots of very interesting questions, and Putin gave us a lot of very interesting insights. And first of all, Putin told us that the Ukrainians were completely defeated during their greatest counter-offensive operation in the vicinity of the Bradley Square and the Vremivka tactical bridgehead and so on. Also, Vladimir Putin added one of the most important things that probably nobody mentioned, but I paid attention to this, and later we will discuss and you will understand what exactly Putin was talking about. Also, Putin told us that currently the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate forces at some directions. We see this. He told us that the Russians, Putin, the Russian military authorities see this concentration of forces, and the Russians are doing everything they can to prevent any negative things from this concentration of forces. So the question is where exactly the Ukrainians are concentrating their forces, what exactly the Ukrainians are planning to do, and what is the real purposes of Russian offensive operation in Avdiivka, or what is the real purposes of Avdiivka News operation. So now let's try to understand what was Putin talking about. And today when I was walking through the Western deployment maps, I found a very interesting detail, very interesting information that probably explained me, at least to me, everything. If you have access to the Western deployment map, you're gonna see that Ukrainians have redeployed significant number of their forces in direction of Nikolaev. To be more precise, the Ukrainians have completed the redeployment of 35th Marine Brigade in this area. The Ukrainians have completed their redeployment of 38th Marine Brigade. Also, the Ukrainians redeployed in this area 36th Marine Brigade and of course 37th Marine Brigade. So basically the Ukrainians completed the redeployment of 4 Marine brigades in direction of Nikolaev. These are brigades from the strategical reserves that during June, July and August took part in the battle for Vremivka tactical bridgehead. All those 4 brigades were involved in the battle for Vremivka, for Urozhaine, for Makarovka, Blagodatne, and some parts of those brigades, some battalions were exactly involved in those operations. And since, according to information we have, those brigades didn't lose their combat capabilities, but they were involved in combat. So basically those 4 strategical brigades of strategical reserves, 35th, 36th, 37th and 38th brigade, haven't lost their combat capabilities. This is one thing. The second thing, they weren't defeated, they had real battle experience and they are ready to do something. And this is very weird when talking about the situation, why the Ukrainians took a decision to redeploy their forces in Nikolaev. And obviously I understand, and now I understand the words of Putin, that one more time, he told us that we see that Ukrainians try to concentrate forces at some direction with attempts to start another offensive operation, and we do everything we have to prevent the failure or something bad consequences of that attack. So as I understand, the Ukrainians currently try to concentrate their forces along Dnieper River with the purpose to start crossing operation in this area. Now everything explain us, at least Russian bombings with FAB-500, how the Russians were bombing heavily this territory during the previous days and months. We remember that if we increase even updates since the beginning of September, how the Russians were bombing this territory heavily with FAB-500. The cities like Berislav, these cities, we remember those cities that were under Russian attack, like Berislav, Kazatsky, Burgunka, Lvova, Tyaginka. All these cities were Adradakamyanka, Mykolaievka, all those cities were reduced to ruins as a result of usage of FAB-500 by the Russian side. But you need to understand the difference. The Russians were attacking not the forces of that strategical reserves like 37th, 36th Brigade. The Russians were bombing the positions of forces of 126th Territorial Defense Brigade, of 124th, 22nd and probably 21st. The Ukrainians, using these 4 territory defense brigade, were using the main job. They were trying to develop their positions along the islands between Dnieper rivers. Those brigades of defense brigades captured the islands between Russian and Ukrainian banks of Dnieper river, all over the combat line, in between Kazachye Lagery, on the south of Kazatska, Adradakamyanka, Mykolaievka, on the south of Kherson, in the vicinity of Dachin, Antonov Bridge. All these islands were captured by the territory defense brigade. And as I understand, currently the Ukrainians have completed their operation, their mission, and I expect that even before the beginning of November, the Ukrainians will launch their crossing Dnieper operation with one purpose: to save the military aid and to save the investments from the Western countries, from the United States of America and so on. The Ukrainians don't have any other option. If they can't show any results, any progress from their side, they will lose the last finance, last investment, and the Western countries will turn their focus on Israel, and because nobody likes to lose, and no matter that Western countries have a lot of money, they also don't want to lose. And Israel, for example, from their perspective, is a very good short war that can be completed very fast, where the Western countries can be winners. And of course, it's always good to be winners. Furthermore, we know that United States of America is going to have elections very soon, and this is going to might be a very good case for Joe Biden in upcoming elections of 2024. So Zelensky is losing. He needs to start something to save the to save money and to save finance. And to do this, the only thing he has is to start lending operation on the Russian bank of New River. During the previous day, the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking this territory with all types of weapons they have. For example, in this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian Uragan, and as a result of HIMARS strike, that Russian Uragan was destroyed. Furthermore, the Ukrainians continue attacking and bombing the Russian cities on this bank of the river, like Kazachie, Lahiri. The Ukrainians were bombing the cities like just a second, like Kazachie, Lahiri, like Pishanovka. On this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the movements and redeployment of Russian forces, and as a result of artillery strike they managed to destroy a small let's say ammo depot. The Ukrainians are using FPV drones heavily all over the combat over the river, trying to attack the Russian forces. But from the other side we see that the Russians also, according to Putin, they see everything and they do everything they have not to allow the Ukrainians to achieve a success, and the Russians are trying to dig in deeper to get more forces and to prepare the foothold and to prepare a warm meeting for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, I'll remind you that according to information we have, the Russians have redeployed some forces of ex-Wagner group in this direction to support the Russians in this area. So we'll see. And one more time, I expect this operation to begin before the beginning of November. According to Minister of Defense, as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 20 soldiers and 2 armored vehicles. And this Dnieper operation completely explained me at least the Russian attempt to attack in direction of Avdiivka. The Russians in Avdiivka currently are trying to make the same, to repeat the same success as they managed to achieve during the battle for Bakhmut. If you remember, when the Ukrainians launched their greatest offensive operation in Bakhmut, trying to return control over Klishchiivka and Andreevka, the Russians launched attack in Kupinsk direction, in direction of Sinkovka and Petropavlovka. And as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy some strategical reserves to the north, and basically that saved the Russians in Avdiivka and completely collapsed the Ukrainian offensive operation. And now the Russians see that Ukrainians have concentrated their forces in on Kherson, very far from the main combat line, and they launch offensive operation in the south Donetsk direction in Avdiivka, and the most important in Novomykhailovka and Priyutina. So the area from Avdiivka and Priyutina is the area of the Russian greatest offensive operation, counter-offensive operation. And I'll remind you one more time that this is exactly the area where the Ukrainians used to keep and used to have those 4 Marine brigades, 35th, 36th, 37th and 38th. Currently the Ukrainians are no longer have any strategical reserves, and the most powerful forces, most experienced forces, they removed from this area to Kherson, and now the Russians see that there is a real lack of forces from the Ukrainian side, and this is the best time, the best period of time to start offensive operation. The Russians are able to achieve at least a few results, few goals as a result of this attack. First one, they will ruin the Ukrainian plans, and they will force the Ukrainians to move forces back, and this is also a very big achievement, because in this perspective the entire operation will be ruined. And from the other side, if the Ukrainians take a decision not to return back forces, the Russians will continue the pressure and obviously will be able to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt in Novomykhailovka, on the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, Ugledar and Avdiivka. All these cities can fall easily. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Avdiivka direction, on Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 410 soldiers. Significant number of losses from the Ukrainian side. And if you remember, yesterday the Ukrainians lost just 185 soldiers. Probably there was some kind of operational pause, but today the level of losses is significant, 410,010 soldiers. Very big losses for the Ukrainians, but yet the Russians haven't managed to develop further their offensive operation. And as I understand, they're not planning to do this very fast. This is a classic, let's say, news, and this is Avdiivka news. The Russians are going to go very slowly, step by step, trying to tightening the news very slow, and with every single step the Russians will try to reduce the level of oxygen that Ukrainian forces are able to get inside of Avdiivka. We haven't received almost nothing from this area for today, just few geolocations from the Ukrainian side of bombing and clashes. The only interesting video we need to discuss is the Russian attacks with anti-tank missiles against the Ukrainian positions on this landfill. I can't tell you when exactly this video was made. Some sources are saying that maybe on the 10th 10th of October during the previous day of clashes. But this is like the video how the Russians were trying to suppress and destroy the Ukrainian fire positions, I positions on top of hill. So, but yet one more time we haven't received even a single confirmation that as a result of clashes the Russians managed to return or capture this landfill and so on. So basically the clashes currently continues along the railway on the east of Stepova and Berdichi, and we'll see what is going to be next, obviously. Now we are moving to the south, Donetsk direction. We also haven't received almost nothing from this area. And there were no clashes in Novomikhailivka, no activity at all. Maybe there were some video geolocate videos, but probably we're going to see them. We're going to get them tomorrow. When talking about Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the Russians, as we discussed, launched a counter-offensive operation, and today during the day, the Ukrainians have already lost 155 soldiers on this direction, the South Donetsk direction. And I'll remind you one more time that the forces of 36, 37, 38, and 35th brigades were located in this area. I remember how the forces of 36th brigade were trying to capture, and basically they captured the city by the name of Rovnopol, the city where currently the Russians are planning to counterattack. So we see that Ukrainians have lack and they have gap in forces. There are a lot of like big holes in their defense in this area, and this is the reason why the Russians took a decision to counterattack. Furthermore, I remember that during the final phase of clashes for Bradley Square, the Ukrainians have redeployed the 36th brigades in this area, probably to get more experience. But now the 36th brigade was also removed from this territory, and the Russians also launched a counterattack. The Russians have already cut the Ukrainian a small salient artillery back between Robotyne and Verbova. I have updated the map on the west of Verbova, as we discussed in the previous video, that as a result of counter-offensive operation the Russians managed to return control over this territory as well. So the Russians are counter-attacking while the Ukrainians are trying to redeploy so needed forces, so much needed forces to Kherson. And meanwhile the Ukrainians are launching another wave of mobilization. Don't forget about this. When talking about the north of Kopany, the Russians also control the entire situation. They're bombing and attacking the Ukrainians all over the fields, all over the combat line, using different types of weapons, trying not to allow the Ukrainians to concentrate forces. But the question I have, where exactly the Ukrainians are taking forces to concentrate? And as I understand, this is not even attacks against the concentration of Ukrainian forces. Probably these are attacks to force the Ukrainians to step back before the Russians launch their offensive operation. Anyway, as I understand, based on the configuration of the front line for both sides, either from the Russians and the Ukrainians, I understood one thing, that this year is not going to be ended as the previous year, as the most of this year. Obviously, we're going to see a tactical defeat for one of the sides. Currently, I can't tell you exactly who is going to be defeated. I think that Ukrainians will be defeated, because to implement Dnieper operation, anyway, you're going to have significant number of losses. So this year, for the first time since the special military operation at the beginning, one of the sides, or the Russians or the Ukrainians, will receive a tactical defeat. There were like operational defeats. For example, the Ukrainians were operationally defeated in the Bakhmut. The Russians had some defeat in Kharkiv during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But now there's going to be something more, something bigger. And this something bigger obviously is going to take place in Kherson and during the upcoming like few months. When talking about Bradley Square, that as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost 55 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. So the level of losses is the same as we used to see like during the previous weeks. When talking about Bakhmut Artyomov's direction, as we discussed, the Ukrainians managed to force the Russians to step back from the Klishchevka and Andreevka, and currently the Ukrainians managed to dig in deeper along the railways from Bakhmut to Kurdyumovka. The Russians see and control the situation, and they're launching attacking the Ukrainians all along the railways without any movements from both sides, because neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have possibilities to attack, and as I understand, not just possibilities, but nobody wants and nobody wishes to risk. Currently the situation is stabilized, and now everybody is focused on its own direction. The Russians on Avdiivka and South Donetsk, the Ukrainians try to concentrate and prepare the battle for Kherson. Furthermore, I'll remind you that a few days ago Zelensky himself personally visited Kherson, and obviously he arrived there to give his final orders to commanders to check the situation, to fill the situation. Obviously, the Kherson offensive operation is under complete Zelensky control. He took a decision to be completely responsible for this operation and not to risk anymore and not to allow anyone else to control this operation. He wants to see everything because this is his last chance. This is his final shot, and if he loses, and as I understand he's going to lose, he will lose everything. So he's going to he's rising the stakes, and he's going all in. Obviously this is all in for the Ukrainians and for Ukraine as well. The Russians, as a result of clashes on Artyomov's direction, managed to discover a lot of artillery positions, a lot of Ukrainian ammo depots, and as a result of artillery strikes, as a result of drone strikes, and as a result of counter-artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost significant number of forces, artillery positions, and ammo depots, but without any changes on the ground. The Ukrainians from their side managed to discover the Russian ammo depot, local ammo depot, somewhere in the vicinity of Dubovo-Vasilievka, and as a result of artillery strike, that ammo depot was damaged, but then there was like a secondary detonation, and as a result of secondary detonation we can see a very powerful explosion, very powerful one. So just like a local success of the Ukrainian forces in this area. No changes on Sivers's direction. The Russians continue bombing and attacking like the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Sporne. Just a regular military routine without any attempts from both sides to attack. Just a regular thing, trying to reduce as much as possible the number of enemy's forces. Like the Russians try to reduce the Ukrainians are trying to reduce the Russian forces. But maybe there are going to be some attacks as soon as the Ukrainians will be completely out of reserves, because even if they're going to launch like mobilization, they need time to prepare them and so on, and I'm not sure that the Western countries are going to start preparation or continue preparation of the Ukrainians. We remember that, for example, United Kingdom promised to move some training center on the territory of Ukraine, so very difficult to understand situation, but anyway, as I told you, by the end of this year, one of the side will receive a tactical defeat. When talking about Kupiansk and Liman, there are no changes. There are very heavy clashes on the CVT of Makiivka. The Ukrainians still hold the situation, this area, the Russians attacks, and the Minister of Defense, for example, today reported that as a result of clashes on Liman direction, as a result of Russian active defense operations, they managed to decrease losses, had around 180 soldiers, and this is like the heaviest level of losses of the Ukrainians since the beginning of the special military operation on Liman direction. I don't remember such a big and heavy numbers for a very long time ago. Maybe during the active phase of clashes for Bakhmut, the Russians were attacking in this area, and there were the level of losses around 120 and 30, and 180 is a very big number. And probably the main losses of the Ukrainian forces took place exactly in the vicinity of Makiivka, where the Russians, using significant number of armored vehicles, are trying to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt and basically to enter the city from the east to the west, but yet without any progress on the ground, just the clashes like around the city. When talking about Kupiansk's direction, we got just one unconfirmed message about the Russian progress in Sinkovka that they managed to enter, but yet we haven't received even a single geolocated video about that. And probably that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.